to make intuitive sense that if you grow food closer to home, less energy will be involved in getting it to your plate. Of course, the very best solution is to grow it yourself in your backyard. But I can tell you, going back and forth to a farm, you have to take into account the fact that global transportation is somewhat efficient because they're transporting massive quantities of food on a boat to get here. But that doesn't take into account all of the other transportation steps. And it also requires, if food is going to be traveling such large distances, it requires that the food be somewhat not perishable.
According to one study, they say that average salad that we're eating at home, the ingredients have traveled 3,000 miles, so that's a 3,000-mile salad.
Yeah,
so
it's insane.
So
really, the best way to do it is to grow your own food. And to eat seasonally. Don't say, I need to have a super ripe tomato in the dead of winter. Because if you're going to put a super, first of all, it doesn't exist. If you're going to rely upon tomatoes that were transported across the world, they're going to taste like cardboard, not a tomato. So learn to eat seasonally, and learn to eat locally, and ideally learn to grow your own, because it's not a lot of work. But whether or not the math supports the idea that long-distance travel of food contributes to more greenhouse gas emissions than eating local food, whether or not the math agrees for the greenhouse gas emission part of the equation, it still makes sense to eat locally, to help your local economy. And because of the fact that this bulk food has to transport large distances, it can't be picked when it's ripe, because once it gets to your table, it'll be rotten. So it's picked when it's not ripe, and when it gets to your table, it tastes like cardboard. And it's not nutritionally superior, it's nutritionally inferior to food that you would get, that you grew yourself or bought from a local grower. And local, I don't mean Fresno, I mean close to home. All right, so the closer you are to home, the greater the benefit is to your economy and to the quality of the food you're eating, whether or not it affects global warming. That's not my field. I don't know. To grow food, you need water. To grow food sustainably, you need water sustainably. 75% of the fresh water worldwide is used for agriculture. 40% of the grain worldwide, and again, grain is what countries think about because grain is where the calories are. 40% of the grain is irrigated, needs water. The farmers need water to grow it. Yet more than half of the people in the world live in countries where the water under the earth, the water table is dropping because the water is being sucked out of the ground for irrigating the agricultural crops. And that includes here in California. The San Joaquin Valley, half of the valley has dropped as much as 28 feet. And this was 40 years ago. 50 years ago. So it's worse now. And that's because the water's being pumped to feed our food crops. That's a serious issue. So one way to resolve the water problem is to try to conserve water by switching to more efficient irrigation methods. Growing crops that don't require as much water. Like wheat doesn't require as much water as rice does. Reuse water, reclaim water, use gray water, water that comes from your sink. Okay, and use biodegradable soaps and put it out into the landscape instead of throwing it into the water system that you pay for anyway. The more water you put down the drain, the more you have to pay for. Tear out your grass and grow food instead, at least you'll be using the water for growing food instead of just something water hungry. And governments should charge more for the water, although I would prefer they charge less. I would prefer that they would charge less if we're growing food at home. But at least for the large agribusinesses, discourage waste by charging them more when they waste water. And I'm not a vegetarian, but animal products do use more water because you have to grow the food to feed the animals, and it just increases the amount of water necessary to yield the final food product. Chickens are relatively water efficient, but the higher you go up the food chain, the more water is required to maintain them. That is, if you grow them on grain. There are sustainable ways of growing these animals that don't require as much water. But if you're going to grow them on grain, then you're using water. So reduce our reliance on animal products that were grown on grain. Agriculture needs soil. Sustainable agriculture needs our soil to last. Franklin Roosevelt, a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. We need to learn from history. Find the book Collapse and read it. The Mayan Empire declined because they didn't treat their soil with care. Forest clearing for the purpose of growing food led to soil erosion and then starvation and the end of the civilization. We've had similar, it wasn't the end of our civilization, but it had negative consequences in the U.S. as well, during the 1930s when the Great Plains was, the prairies were removed and the topsoil eroded, creating the Great Dust Bowl, and then the emigration of farmers from there. So overplowing, overgrazing, and cutting forests down results in soil erosion, and without fertile soil, we can't grow food. And a third of the world's topsoil is being lost, and it's not sustainable. We can't make it as fast as it goes away, at least using the practices that they're using, that most people use. So instead, we need to find alternative ways of growing food that doesn't result in destroying our soil. Replant grasslands. Grasslands that were lost, we need to regenerate them. The grass there helps maintain soil. Terracing, if you're going to farm on some area that is not totally flat, and if you create these terraces with boundaries, it helps the soil from just washing away when it rains. Plant trees to block wind erosion. And there are other means of soil conservation as well called no-till farming. Instead of the practice of constantly digging up the soil each and every year before you plant your new crop, no-till farming, where it's not dug, it's just planted, is giving good results, good yields. And fertilizers. One way to enrich the soil, okay, big ag, they strip the soil of nutrients and they add them right back with chemicals. Right? Fertilizers. And fertilizer is a big $10 million industry in the U.S. This month there was a disaster in Texas that resulted in, it wasn't even a manufacturing plant, it was just a storage facility of a fertilizer storage that blew up. They had 270 tons. They had much more fertilizer on site than they were allowed to have. And it blew up and killed several people. It's a dangerous business, but farmers use it because it's cheap. But at what cost? It's at the cost of our environment. Nitrogen fertilizer, which is the brown stuff, which is the bulk of the fertilizer sold, is made chemically by using natural gas as an energy source to ignite the nitrogen that's in our atmosphere with the hydrogen that's in natural gas to make